Hi, hello. My name is Kory Saunders. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm the Assistant Director for Strategic Marketing, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Study Abroad Office. And I'm a part of the Gender and Equity Committee. I have the opportunity to introduce our facilitator for this conversation, which is Coffee Mugs and Conversation. I have my favorite coffee mug right here. It is Winnie the Pooh, Eeyore, and Piglet too, given to me by my best friends while I was in college. So I want to introduce our facilitator for this conversation. And sorry, they are mowing the lawn outside as I speak. In this conversation, we will discuss the NC State Common Read of Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. So our facilitator, Tatiana Heights, who uses she, her, their pronouns, is a doctoral student majoring in agricultural and extension education. Her research interests include multicultural environmental education, culturally relevant teaching, environmental justice, and community building in marginalized communities. Prior to now, Tatiana received a Master's of Community and Regional Planning degree with a focus on prosperity in Black communities, and a Bachelor of Arts with a focus in sustainable communities. Additionally, Tatiana is an avid traveler and reader with 7 years of experiences as an informal educator and 3 years of experience as a city planner. Tatiana, we welcome you.
What? The sound went away there. Okay. Well, thank you all. I hope that everyone has had the opportunity to read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, because it is an amazing book. Actually, I had read this book the summer before the school year started last year, and I didn't even realize that it was going to be the common read. I'm just a really big Trevor Noah fan, and I love memoirs and books. Yeah, awesome. But then I ended up going through it a second time after realizing that it was the common read, and had the opportunity to facilitate a conversation about the book for a class that I was doing with 2 of my classmates. So as Kory said, a part of my research is around culturally relevant pedagogy. So that's just really about teaching strategies that we use as educators in whatever educational setting that we're working in. So I just want to be transparent in saying that a lot of how I processed this book was kind of through that culturally relevant pedagogy lens. So what that really means is cultivating socio-political awareness in the students that I work with, developing cultural competence, which means being deeply rooted in one's own culture, but also having some understanding of at least one other culture, and then having a strong focus on student learning and really believing in all students' ability to succeed academically. So I found that there were a lot of connections between those 3 areas in this book, even though it probably was not intentional. He was just kind of telling his story, but there was a lot of kind of connections to that. So I did come up with a little PowerPoint. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right, here we go. And so this, as it is a coffee mug conversation, this is going to be very conversational. So I do expect a lot of participation as we go through this. So please don't hesitate to hit that unmute button or add questions to the chat, and Kory can kind of facilitate those questions. But again, we're going through Born a Crime, Stories from a South African Childhood by Trevor Noah. The book really goes through Trevor Noah's life growing up. He talks a lot about his experiences being kind of in a single parent household, He talks about his experiences with being biracial in a time where that was really illegal in South Africa. Black people and white people were not allowed to date, to procreate, to get married, none of those things. But his mother found a loophole because in South Africa at the time they had what they called, you know, Black people and then white people and then this other group of people which were called colored people. So people who were of multiple races. And so while it was illegal for a Black person and a white person to procreate together, it wasn't illegal for a colored person and another colored person, so two biracial people to procreate. So his mother found a loophole that that she was just his nanny, and he was actually a colored kid. And so she kind of, for the first few years of his life, raised him like that and pretended to be his nanny, and that's how they went through life and kind of gamed the system. So he talks about that experience of having to hide and not being able to play with other kids, and his father eventually leaving and not being able to reconnect with him for a number of years. And he tells a number of stories about his experiences in the schooling system and with his mother and his grandparents and his cousins and people in the neighborhood and all of the experiences that he went through in South Africa before he ever became the famous Trevor Noah comedian that we know today. So on the screen in front of you, you'll see some themes that I found when I was reading the book, and maybe there are others that other people found when they were reading the book, and feel free to share those. But firstly, the intersection of social, class, privilege, and language, because like I said, they were living in apartheid in the time of the Immorality Act, which really talked about how people were kind of separated and segmented in society. The South African government studied all different racist societies and tried to blend them together into the most perfect racism. They talk about systematic differences across educational environments, because he talks about, you know, private schools and non-private schools, and he talks about gifted classes and non-gifted classes and all of the educational experiences that he had, being in classrooms with white people or being in classrooms with other Black students or being in classrooms with Indian students and all of that. The domestic and global effects of colonialism, so white people, you know, colonizing an area and what the experiences of that. The influence of race on and racial identity on various experiences. He talks about the role of familiar relationships. There's a lot of stories about what his experiences were in his own household, and with his mother having a new marriage and reconnecting with family members who've left your life when you haven't seen them in a number of years. He talks about language and how people perceive us and interact with us. He was able to learn several different languages. There were a number of different languages and people couldn't always communicate with each other in that area, but he was in a unique position that he knew a lot of different languages because that's something that his mother and his stepfather kind of imparted on him. And so he was able to communicate with a lot of different groups of people, and that wasn't common during that apartheid time. And then there's also some conversations about the treatment of women and the experiences of women. So I have some discussion questions that are kind of around these different themes, and I would love to get people's talking about that. So firstly, keeping with the theme of our Gender and Equity Research Symposium, we're talking about valuing scholarship through lived experience, which is exactly what Trevor Noah's book embodies. He's telling his own story, but it also seems like there's kind of some scholarly themes going on, given that, you know, he's also talking about the history of the time, and he's talking about kind of some of the laws and things that, and he's talking about kind of the societal structures. And so it's not just about his life, it's also kind of research and kind of an ethnography, if you will. So I think that for me, that really brought out some kind of action research themes, because in traditional research, we don't really value people's own voice. But for me, I'm an action researcher, so I really do value using your own story and your own voice, using the story and the voice of the participants in whatever thing you might be researching, and then using that to forever cycle through and make changes. So that's kind of something that I kind of pulled from this and that I saw from this, and how I could see it as a useful tool in that way. But the question that I want to ask others is, what ways do you see Trevor Noah's book as both a memoir and a scholarly text? What kind of themes did you see that pulled out that theme of the conference, or the symposium, I should say, for us?
Tatiana, I think that it also goes with the theme of amplifying voices, because a lot of times when you think of South Africa and you think of and you hear stories, it's often not from a colored person's perspective. Mm-hmm. It is from other perspectives that don't always allow for the voices of the way in the way in which Trevor Noah has described his lived experience. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was, and the way that he also intentionally included other voices, not just his own, and their experiences and how they were woven together, from whether it was his classmates, whether it was his family. He also wove in other experiences to not only amplify his own, but amplify those that he knew personally.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on. For me personally, making it this point in life, and being aware of apartheid and being aware of kind of what went on during that period of time, I had never, ever heard about it from the perspective of someone who was identified as colored during that time. You always hear about Nelson Mandela and, kind of Black liberation that happened post-apartheid and things like that, but I never heard about the perspective of a colored person during that time. So I think you're totally right that was a definite new voice. And also, yeah, definitely weaving in people's experiences outside of himself. Talking about classmates' experiences and talking about neighbors' experiences, and some of his friends who were, as he called it, hustlers, they were always hustling and talking about all of that. So I think, yeah, there were definitely a lot of voices that we got to hear about that's not, the traditional, we're hearing about this person who was super instrumental in the movement, or we're hearing about this person who was really oppressing others. We're hearing more than just what's in the textbooks. It's a different perspective that's not usually brought to the table. So I think that's really spot on. And that's why, as an educator, I could definitely see this as a book that I would use in a classroom setting. Did anybody else want to comment on that? What other thoughts do people have?
We have one comment in the chat. It says, okay. Kory's response makes a connection for me with a TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story, which that TED Talk is amazing. So yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of those really popular TED Talks. And I have seen it, but it's not one that I could say, I can quote from it and,
so
say that exactly, but.
The Danger of a Single Story is one that I actually used to use in my classes, and it is, oh man, thank you. Chimamanda Adichie is the person who gave that TED Talk, and it is basically, the single story is a single perspective, or it's where you look at something singularly. So instead of looking at it like Trevor Noah, who incorporated all these voices within his voice, within his story, as he amplified both his voice and other voices, a single story tells it from a single perspective. So it is a really good TED Talk. I think I'll probably try to find it and put it in the chat so that people can watch that TED Talk as well. But she does a really great job at illustrating how important it is to not just go with that single story that you either may have heard from someone else, or that but to really go outside and have multiple perspectives. Thank you, Jeannie, for putting it in the chat already. To understand the entire versus just the singular. So it's understanding more of the whole and more of lived experiences by many versus just going with one story alone, almost how you were talking about earlier with just the story of Nelson Mandela or just the story of the oppressor. But now we have all of these stories that actually make up the lived experiences of that time versus one.
Yeah, that's definitely very spot on and relevant to this conversation. That reminds me of an organization that I was involved in, and they framed it in the form of the stories most often told. So what we usually get to hear versus what might be some counter narratives around a certain issue. So yeah, I think that's really, really super relevant, and people should definitely watch that TED Talk if you have time, because it sounds like it's really salient for people as it relates to this conversation.
We have two more comments. Veronica says, I agree with these points, and research is so often missing voices of marginalized, and researchers struggle to make it feel safe and helpful to engage certain voices. So using memoirs is sometimes the only way to bring those stories to the classroom.
Yeah, there is an instructor here at NC State, Dr. Sarah Cannon, and she teaches about, I think she works mostly with undergrads. I've never actually taken a class from her, but she teaches about diversity and equity in for College of Ed students. And she's talked about how she brings in memoirs in the class, and that's a really big piece of the class is hearing other people's stories and using these memoirs as an educational tool, which is not common because, like, you know, it's always these textbooks or these journal articles, but using memoirs, depending on your field, is not very common. And so I really commend her for doing that. And it really gets back at that cultural competence piece that I was talking about in terms of the culturally relevant pedagogy, because it's having some fluency about someone else's experience who's maybe from a different identity, a different culture than your own. So yeah, I think memoirs are super, super critical. I love memoirs. Is actually my favorite genre of books. I've read so many memoirs. If anybody ever wants some recommendations on some good ones, I've got a long list.
And then Veronica says memoirs can be seen as a version of narrative qualitative research, which goes right along with what you just said.
Yeah, definitely. There is, oh man, I can't remember, but there's this woman who talks about the queering of race, because she's an interracial, she's not just two races. I think she was like three different races. And so she talks about her experience and her racial identity as queer, but she was actually doing a scholarly article that was actually just mostly about her own narrative. And that was the first time I had seen an article like that was actually published in a peer-reviewed journal. And it was kind of mind-boggling to me at the time. But now, through this book, I really see how that's, you really don't know how valuable that is until you experience it for the first time. But yeah. So
we have one more comment, Tatiana.
Okay.
Angela, stories are powerful. Think about marketing commercials. Stories and connections make change. A study by Brockman and Callis created change in opinion on political policy in a study in Florida. On transgender policy, Brockman, maybe, but the idea was telling a story and making a connection.
Yeah, storytelling is definitely getting more popular in certain circles. I'm going through some critical race theory literature right now, and storytelling is a popular method in terms of doing critical race theory research. Storytelling is one of the kind of foundational pieces. So yeah, I think that's definitely getting more popular, especially given, which field that you might be in. In some fields, maybe not so much, but hopefully that we'll start to see that grow in other fields as well. So another theme that I kind of saw in the book was about education. So this first bullet that you see on the screen is a quote from the book. So this is a part in the book when Trevor Noah had been put into these honors classes, and he was in a room full of white students, and he didn't really feel like he was fitting in with them. And so he asked his guidance counselor if he could move into the B class, which is what they called it. And she was trying to talk him out of it. She's like, no, why would you want to go into that class? You know, you're smart and you should be in this honors class. This is where you belong. And he's like, no, I want to go into this other class. There have to be some smart kids in that class. And she's like, no, there aren't. But he wanted to be in that class because that's where all of his friends were. And she's like, you know, you don't want to be with those kids. So, the way that he talks about education and weaving in his own story is really, it might just be his story, but it's also indicative of the broader kind of academic experience. We know from literature that that Black students in particular are overrepresented in special education classes and underrepresented in honors classes. That's super uncommon. I actually have a student who is, he goes to school in Durham, and he's a fair-skinned Black student, and he's the only one in the honors classes at his school. And so while this was Trevor Noah's experience, it's also super common in the broader scheme of things that people have these lower expectations of what BIPOC, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color, people can achieve. And so I think, yeah, it's definitely indicative of the larger society, even though it's also his story. So a question that I have as it pertains to that is, how can schools be a formal or informal setting for addressing bias? Use examples from the book or from your own experience. I would love to hear about some people's experiences as it relates to this topic, if anyone has any. This to me, again, like I said, I view things through the lens of culturally relevant pedagogy. And so to me, this was really hitting on that point of culturally relevant pedagogy as it relates to the focus on student learning and believing that all students have the ability to be successful academically. Unfortunately, there's a lot of teachers who don't hold that belief that all students can succeed. Some teachers, unfortunately, think that students are biologically inferior, or, you know, something is wrong with the student, and so they're not able to learn, and so they don't put as much effort into educating those students because they have this misconception that the student isn't able. So for me, I like to tear down that perspective and tear down that narrative and really believe that all students can engage in coursework that's academically rigorous and that every student can be successful in the classroom.
So we have some chats regarding this.
Right.
Marcella, definitely see this with bilingual and immigrant kids. Yeah. Shantoneeka, my white classmates telling me that I was cheating in an advanced math class because I knew answers to questions. My white teachers did nothing. And
Terrible.
Then, Marcella, this is a big reminder of importance of educators of color and educators who understand cultural competence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like the comment about language being multilingual, or maybe even just not having English as a student's language that they speak in their home. I have a friend who came to the US from Mexico in 5th grade or something like that, and they put her back a grade because she didn't speak English, not because she couldn't understand the content, not because she had any sort of learning disability, but merely because she didn't speak English. And unfortunately, that is extremely common, that students will be put into special education classes, or they have to learn English to be able to engage in the school system, and it's just not right at all. I talked about my research in multicultural environmental education, which is really about connecting environmental education back to the student's own culture and experience. And I saw some research where someone was using environmental education to teach students English. And I was just like, no, that is not, that is not where we need to go. You need to teach students in whatever language is most comfortable for them, whatever language they want to learn in. Can you please read to me that second comment again? Because something came to my mind and then I lost it.
My white classmates telling me that I was cheating in advanced math class because I knew answers to questions. My white teacher did nothing.
Yeah. I was thinking about a show that I was watching recently where there was, it's a fictional show, but and it's based in the 70s, and there was a girl who was really inclined for science and math, and she had the exact same answers on her test as the kid who was sitting next to her, and the teacher assumed that she was the one who was cheating because she was a girl, and girls are not supposed to be good at science and math. Girls are underrepresented in STEM. And this other student was Asian, and there was this misconception that Asian students are really, really good at science and math. And please, if you have time, look up some literature on the model minority myth, which talks about these unrealistic expectations that are put on Asian students because they're put together, they're aggregated all into one group instead of recognizing the differences between different countries. So maybe it is, common that students from some countries in Asia do study science and math more often, but then people will have Cambodian students in their classroom or Vietnamese students in their classroom, and they'll be conflating them with other students who, when you disaggregate the data, might succeed in those areas, and they'll just lump them all together. And so there has been some issues with suicide of Asian students because of this idea of who's good at science, who's good at math. It's not women. It is these students of, so I think, yeah, that's a super, super relevant thing to look into. Yeah, thank you for bringing up that comment, and very, very disappointing, that teacher. Very, very.
Yes, and you have participants agreeing with you in regards to the model minority myth and how it really hurts people, both having unreal expectations and not providing support, and how implicit bias plays into those roles.
Yeah, I think so many times teachers don't even notice their biases are they don't even know that they have those biases, and so you can't do anything about it if you don't recognize that you have the bias in the first place. You can't solve a problem if you don't recognize that it exists, but 100%. And I just want to say too that even if certain groups do excel when you disaggregate the data, that does not lead to it being a biological thing. We have to look at the systems and what's going on around that student. What sort of supports are they getting? How is their education structured? It's not this, I'm born with a certain racial identity, and so I'm able to succeed. I'm born with a certain sex or a certain gender, and so I'm able to succeed or not able to succeed. That's not it at all. We need to look at how those teachers are teaching and what's going on, and how the students are receiving that knowledge that's helping them to succeed and not others. So.
And then we have Angela G. I am thinking about Monique Morris' Push Out and how the real experiences of girls of color being criminalized in schools are connected to how they experience the world. These real experiences catalyzed into research create space to think about and inform policy around real everyday issues, which is streaming. It may still be streaming for free until April 13th. So might be a good thing to look at over the weekend.
Yes, I watched that last week and it was heartbreaking. There are these young Black girls who are having these traumatic experiences in schools, and the teachers really didn't see an issue with it. Certain teachers, the ones who were talking who were giving their dialogue, obviously saw an issue, and that kind of led to there's a book as well. So even if after the 13th, if you don't get to watch the documentary, there is a book of the same title, Push Out. And there was a young Black girl who was dragged from her classroom, and the teacher just, dragged her and just left her out in the hallway. And it reminded me when I was in second grade, there was a teacher, he was a white man, And I'm from Chicago, so I honestly did not have very many white teachers in my K through 12 experience. I had so many Black and brown teachers and Black women teachers, which is not common for people's educational experience. But there's this one of like 3 white male teachers I had K through 12. There was this one in second grade who would always get mad at students and throw their desks across the classroom. And until I watched that documentary Push Out, I didn't make that connection of like, because in the school, even when I was in first grade, everybody was talking about, oh, when you get to second grade, you're gonna be in that crazy Mr. Kopac's classroom. And it just didn't occur to me that he might have some issues with some bias in how he's treating this class that's a class full of Black students. And I wonder if he would still be having this very angry, inappropriate behavior if it had been a classroom that was not full of Black students. So yes, definitely watch that documentary. It's super interesting and very unfortunate. You might cry, but still watch it.
And there's one more suggestion of a great read, Claude Steele's Whistling Vivaldi.
I haven't read that, but I'm gonna write that down so that I can read that because I love reading. I'm in like 3 different book clubs. Whistling
Vivaldi.
Vivaldi. Okay. All right, moving on. So to me, there were definitely some, I mean, I don't see how it could not be to anybody, some issues of equity, given that it's a society that's dealing with apartheid in the early parts of the book, and then dealing with the aftermath of apartheid after it was over in the book. What did you learn about racial or gender equity from reading Trevor Noah's book? What about what you learned about yourself and how you engage with, what did you learn about yourself and how you engage with race and gender equity? And where did you see yourself and in what ways in terms of when you're reading the book? Did anything remind you of your story? And if so, what were those things that remind you of your story? But also, I just want to say, I guess we don't know if everyone in this conversation has actually read the book or if you're just kind of interested in having a conversation about this. So, are there any people out here who didn't get a chance to read the book?
I have not read the book, but I thought the conversation would be enlightening despite the fact that I have not read the book.
Yeah. I think that's different. I'm so sorry. I've got dogs. Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of things that can be discussed and be useful even if you haven't read the book. And hopefully you will be interested in reading the book after having these conversations. But and I do want to say too that it is available as an audiobook, and listening to him narrate the book is so good. The pronunciation of certain words, if you don't know the language, I think will come through better when listening to the book. And hearing him, I mean, being that he's a performer and someone who's done comedy, hearing him and do the different voices of the characters is just really funny. So there's a lot of serious topics in the book, but there's also so much like lightheartedness and humor that comes through in the book as well.
So we have some comments that regarding people who've not read the book but still find this conversation very interesting. Another comment was interesting, conflicting to have him both aware and still benefiting off of his race.
Yeah, that is a definite fact. There's a scene in the book where Trevor and a friend had been stealing chocolates at a booth in the mall, and they caught them. Trevor, he talks about this in the book, is a very fast runner. And so he ran and he knew the streets very well because he was used to kind of running when he would get into mischief. He talked about how he was a very naughty kid and he knew kind of the way around. So they caught his friend, they didn't catch him. Remember, he really felt most comfortable with Black folks because even though he was biracial, all of his family was Black. That he spent his time with, given the whole situation with the apartheid, and his dad was like the only person in his white family who had been in the country early on in his life. So he didn't engage with that part of his family. So his friend was Black, and they had camera footage, but in those days it was very grainy. It was like black and white. And so they were trying to identify who this kid was with his friend when his friend got caught and Trevor got away. And they thought that it was a white kid on camera because on the black and white, you couldn't tell that he was colored, as they say. So he did not confess. So there was definitely some privilege there, because even though it was kind of a tech issue, he was passing for white in that moment. And so he was able to get away with it because they thought he was a white kid. And so they weren't looking for him. They were looking for somebody else. Yeah, he was definitely aware, but had some benefits. And he also talks about how his grandmother would beat his cousins really bad when they would do something naughty, but he would not get beat because he was biracial. And she really felt like, you know, he's my white grandson. I can't punish him in the way that I can punish my Black grandchildren. And so he got some privileges from that too. So yeah, definitely a fact.
So we have some comments. Many people, well, there's a lot of people who resonated with this story and with Marcella's previous comments. And another one is, it made me feel like when he talked about feeling more comfortable with Black folks, it sounded like he felt like he was able to get away with things. And then another comment is colorism, which is...
That's a whole nother coffee mug conversation about colorism. Yeah, your proximity to whiteness, elevating you in society, you know, darker skin, bad and good. Yeah, definitely. That's a whole nother conversation. Derek Bell has a documentary about, I can't remember what it's called. If anybody has seen this Derek Bell documentary, it's like Space Invaders or something like that. But in it, they talk about the brown paper bag test, about, you know, your shade of your skin, and if, you know, you're considered better because it's lighter or not. If you're the shade of the paper bag or darker, then you Black, and have to deal with all of the oppression that comes along with that. So yeah. Were there any other comments before I move on?
Angela, yes, loves Space Invaders. And did he address colorism in the book?
Did he address colorism in the book? Not directly, no. He didn't. No, not directly. He didn't say, this is, let me talk about colorism. He talked a lot about racism. I think colorism was kind of a byproduct of his conversation about racism, and a byproduct about his conversation about how people were grouped. So yeah, I think it wasn't an intentional conversation, but there were themes of it that were relevant and that came up in the book naturally.
I don't have a comment about colorism, but I want to also think about the gender and equity piece. A story from the book that really resonated with me is when he was talking about the dog. I couldn't figure out how to type this succinctly in the chat, but when he was talking about the dog that he had as a pet, and the dog, who spotlighted me? The dog like left every day and was basically the dog to another little family. And what that meant for him to recognize that you can have a pet, you can have a person in your life, and there's not ownership over that. And I think that's important to think about when we talk about gender and equity. When we talk about what equity looks like, is not ownership over people and ownership over their experiences. And even as we're thinking about how to catalyze this into research, when we're talking about people's lived experiences, Jenny did an awesome job in our last talk on IRB ethics. When we're thinking about who our participants are, we should be benefiting their lived experience in that research. And so also recognizing that their stories are their own, it's not ours to take ownership over. So highlighting that in research and in scholarship. And Trevor Noah did a great job of talking about, this is my story, but in my story, there's my mother's story. That's not my own story. There's my stepfather's story. That's not my own story, but telling those stories in a way that still honors their experiences, that doesn't create space for you to take ownership over what those experiences look like.
Yeah. When you were just talking, it reminded me of the concept of psychopolitical validity. And not really thinking about the well-being of the people in the research when you're conducting research, their well-being, their liberation, and not further perpetuating oppression in the research that we do. Psychopolitical validity is really about community psychologists. That's where it came out of, but I think that it's relevant for other fields as well, and that we should always have in our minds as we're doing research, what is the impact on the people that are really being looked at, and who are participants, and how are we democratizing the experience and even the way that we conduct the research. So,
We have
I think we've
3 minutes left.
Sorry, what?
We have about 3 minutes left.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to skip to an area that I don't think we've touched on, because I have quite a few areas. Oh man, there's just so many things to talk about with this book. It's so good, and there's so much in it. Race, gender. As you're looking at these slides, please feel free to comment on any of them that you want to, if you want to add some comments to the chat, even if I'm skipping past it. But I want to get to this one because we didn't touch on anything that's related to this, and we touched on race. And someone brought up trans earlier, so I think we touched on gender, even though we didn't get as deep as we could. But for those who read the book I had, what did you learn about how domestic violence operates in society by reading this book? For those who haven't read the book, Trevor's mom was in a relationship that included some intimate partner violence. And there was also some child abuse that was happening from his stepfather to him, physical abuse, and I would say probably some emotional abuse as well. But every time that his mother would go to the police, they didn't listen to her. They turned her away. They were just like, oh yeah, that's just your husband being your husband. And then ultimately he ends up, I don't know if I should give a spoiler, but she's okay now, but it escalated really badly. And the police didn't take her seriously. And so he didn't get punished because there hadn't been a string of reports, because they never took her seriously when she came in to file reports. So they never filed any of those complaints. So did anybody want to say anything about domestic violence in society? If there is nothing, I mean, as NC State folks, I don't know how many of us in this room right now are NC State folks, but we have everyone's email address if you just type a person's name in. So if anybody wants to have a conversation offline about this book, feel free to email me. It is tcheight@ncsu.edu. Like I said, I love reading, love books. I'm in multiple book clubs, so I love discussing this stuff. Or even if you just want to have a conversation about these things, not as it relates to this book, but just want to kind of talk more about these issues, I'm all about it. So please do.
And that is our time. We're at 10:45 right now. We want to thank everyone for attending this session virtually. Whether you posted in the chat, whether you spoke up, or whether you were just involved and engaged, however you were, we want to thank you. We want to thank you for your presence and for your willingness to engage with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to what is going on next, which is amplifying the value of lived experiences in scholarship.
Yeah, so we're going to just transition. Shantoneeka Zorn will be talking about Existence as Resistance, which is a virtual gallery workshop exploring Black futurity. This is based on the actual live exhibit that we are not able to see currently, but Shantoneeka will talk a little bit about what that looks like. So I'm going to hand it over to Shantoneeka.
Hi, I'm Shantoneeka. I'm sharing my screen. Not gonna lie, kind of nervous, but that's natural. Hey, Kory, I love you. She's my friend. Yeah, so I'm Shantoneeka. I am a second-year master's student in college counseling student development. I'm one of the graduate assistants for the African American Cultural Center. Part of my role is to create workshops for the gallery exhibits throughout the year. Our most recent one is Existence as Resistance, the Magic in Blackness. So the presentation that you're about to see is a condensed version of the larger workshop that I created for the exhibit. The questions that guided me are, what do I want to say about Afrofuturism and existence as resistance? What does Afrofuturism say about freedom and liberation? Am I in over my head? I wasn't, and I'm still not. So Existence as Resistance, the Magic in Blackness is curated by the NC State's Women's Center in collaboration with the African American Culture Center. It's hosted in our gallery. We offer special acknowledgments to Jacqueline Perry, who I don't know is here, but we love her. Shout out to her, who took our photographs and made us beautiful. We're already beautiful, but she like amplified it. And to Joanna Ali, who led us in creating our community collective joy pieces. This exhibition was curated by Angela, who is the Assistant Director of the Women's Center and a doctoral student in the NC State Higher Education Program. Love her, shout out to her. The exhibition was curated with love and appreciation for the beauty and authenticity that is found in holding stories. So, as you all know, NC State is closed. So Angela and I have worked diligently to create a virtual experience for the exhibit. You can find it at this link, go.ncsu.edu/blackfutures. If you want, you can log in, check it out as we're talking today. I don't know if I'll have time to walk everybody through it, but you know, if you have questions, you can contact me afterward. So Afrofuturism is the reimagining of Black futures through a Black lens and steeped in ancient African traditions and Black identity. It is the envisioning of Black futures that stem from an Afro-diasporic experiences and the creation of new future realities. Alondra Nelson explained Afrofuturism as a way of looking at the subject position of Black people, which covers themes of alienation and aspirations for a utopic future. As I have come to understand and hope to show, Afrofuturism is a framework that can be used to understand the complex nature of Blackness and a challenge to anti-Blackness. Blackness is a personal, emotionally bonding experience that involves sociological, political, and economical identity experienced by folks of African descent. Beginning in the 1960s, there were several key moments that defined the reimagining of Black futures. In 1966, Marvel Comics created the Black Panther, a superhero based in the fictional world of Wakanda, Africa. Replete with vibranium, Wakanda is the pillar of technological advances in this alternate universe. In the 70s and 80s, Octavia Butler solidified her reign as the mother of Afrofuturism. Her works offer the basis of what Afrofuturistic literature draws from. The alternative communities she created drew from African race and culture, but included extraterrestrial and other fantasy elements to establish a strong sense of science fiction. In 1994, Mark Derry defined Afrofuturism in his essay, Black to the Future. Derry believed that African American voices have other stories to tell about culture, technology, and things to come. Alondra Nelson, a graduate student at the time, established the Afrofuturism online community in 1998. In her article, Future Text, Nelson helped to broaden the framework of Afrofuturism to include a deeper exploration of the relationship between technology and members of the African diaspora. In 2018, more than 5 decades after the Black Panther was printed by Marvel Comics, the Black Panther film was released. With the technological advances that took place in our own reality, we were once again able to experience an alternative depiction of modern-day Africa. Wakanda, once hidden behind the guise of a poor African country, reveals itself to be the most technological advanced place in the universe. Its leaders are Black, proud, and badass. Existence as Resistance this exhibit has been a journey, y'all. A journey. I don't have no job no more, but I do, but I don't. When thinking about Afrofuturism as a framework, oof, my slide's out of order. When thinking of Afrofuturism as a framework to understand Blackness, it is important for us to also challenge anti-Blackness. In spite of everything that people of African descent have gone through, we still exist. That existence itself is an act of resistance. Anti-Blackness renders people of African descent categorically unacceptable as human beings, irrespective of their intelligence, character, competence, creativity, or achievements. Throughout our society, you can see the mistreatment of Black bodies. Black bodies are often at the receiving end of biological experiments. Think of the Tuskegee syphilis study, Henrietta Lack, whose legacy lives on even though she does not. Police dogs and water hoses that were used to keep Black and brown folks down during the civil rights movement, and forced sterilization and branding that was most prevalent during slavery. Additionally, many of the technological advances in our society are the innovations of people of the African diaspora. For me, it wasn't until well into my early adulthood that I learned that the stoplights, red, green, and yellow, was the invention of a Black man. That shook me. And so my question for you all to ponder is, can you name a person of Black or African diaspora as an innovator and what their invention is? You don't have to answer this, we don't have time. I wrote like 20 minutes worth of stuff for 15 minutes. So I'll move on. When thinking about the value of lived experience and scholarship, again, there are several moments that have brought us to this point of understanding Afrofuturism as a framework. Just think about our collective experiences with COVID-19. I believe that COVID-19 is Afrofuturistic. It is a chance for Black folks to imagine new realities for the future and to demand them. New realities around our criminal justice system and the over-policing of Black and brown bodies. New realities around ability and healthcare. New realities around productivity and capitalism. Once again, Black people are taking the brunt of an infectious disease in the United States. The coronavirus is disproportionately infecting and killing African Americans across much of the South, a region where Black Americans are more likely to live in poverty and suffer from chronic disease. According to a recent Guardian article, Louisiana reported that 70% of their COVID-19 deaths were African Americans, despite only making up 30% of their state's population. Aisha Davis, Esquire, the director of policy at the AIDS Foundation of Chicago, stated that Black communities have always shown resiliency in the face of hatred, but we deserve a future where we are proven wrong about how much worse our health outcomes will be in relation to other communities. COVID-19 is Afrofuturistic, and it is anti-Black. This anti-Blackness, along with many other reasons, is why we must act now. Join a campaign to close the jails and stop the spread. In jails alone, 2 million people are in cages with little access to adequate health care and highly vulnerable to this epidemic. Challenge companies and demand that they pay employees a living wage of at least $15 an hour. Demand that landlords and mortgage companies suspend rent. This is how we can challenge COVID-19's anti-Blackness while reimagining possibilities for Black futures. Afrofuturism is scholarship. Oof, forgot about my presentation. Intersectionality. Though somewhat unintentional, the connections that I drew through our collective experience of COVID-19 is a perfect example of intersectionality at work. Now, it is not lost to me that you're all scholars and likely have an understanding of intersectionality. We live it every day. But so that Angela doesn't give me the side eye, I'll provide a definition. Every person carries a series of complex identities and backgrounds: age, gender, ability, status, religion, spirituality, race, ethnicity, SES level, affectional orientation and gender orientation, immigrant status, indigenous heritage, mental health status, etc. These identities form multiple perspectives of both privilege and marginalization, as one can be a minority in some statuses and in the majority in others. This complex intersection of identity is called intersectionality. Whenever I think about intersectionality and Afrofuturism, I think about Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer. The album is a celebration of womanhood, queerness, and Blackness, a celebration of the intersection of these three identities. Join me, if you will, if you've seen it. Think of Pink as a video, and the ways in which Janelle Monáe celebrated women who live without vaginas, because having a vagina does not make you a woman. And not having a vagina does not invalidate your identity as a woman. If you've not seen it, I recommend that you do. Dirty Computer is a representation of intersectionality in the artistic form that is Afrofuturism, which is exactly what our exhibit is. So check it out. My offering for you today is to challenge anti-Blackness with 6-word poems. These poems are brief, yet they carry so much. They talk about the generational inequalities, the generational challenges that we face because of anti-Blackness. They're a challenge to anti-Blackness, and they're a call to action. Some of these are from some of the pieces in our exhibit. Others are from authors. You can have your own. We don't have time for you to do that right now, but you can do it later. If you need help, Angela can help you. Additionally, I have some prompts. So as we think about our lived experience and how let me start over. How does your lived experience influence the way that you do scholarship? This is an open discussion. Anybody can join. I'm gonna mute now.
So we have about 2 minutes. If you'd like to discuss these prompts, you can do so verbally, or you can put them in the chat.
I think for me personally, I research Black queer Christians who were raised in non-affirming Christian households. And that was my personal experience. And I was like, I can't be the only one. So that's how my lived experience influences my scholarship.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, keep writing in the chat because I'm out of time. But if you'd like to see the virtual experience again, you can go to go.mcsu.edu/blackfutures. If you have any questions, you can contact me, Shantoneeka Zorn. That's my email, or Angela, that's her email. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Shantoneeka. Let's give some affirmation for such a wonderful, quick 15-minute presentation. If you are going to the poster presentations, you will have to log out of this meeting. There's a separate meeting for poster presentations, and there'll be someone there to greet you and do all of that stuff. Thank you so much. Again, thank you, Shantoneeka.